Hi, my name is Scott Herndon, and I want to talk about CPS, which is Child Protective Services, which in Idaho is part of the Department of Health and Welfare. So recently I had a meeting with the Department of Health and Welfare with a CPS social worker and with their supervisor. I'm going to go ahead and on this video let you listen in to that meeting, and then after you listen to the meeting, I'll make a few points about what you heard in that meeting and my opinion of them. But before that, I want to give you a quick background. We had a child that was hospitalized, very unfortunately, with a very serious medical condition. And during that hospitalization, there were 2 referrals made to CPS. One of them, they didn't open up a case because they didn't find any merit to that. So you're going to hear that referred to in this video. And then the other one was a very narrow question about an NG tube that was placed into our son for nutrition. And so you'll hear that discussed in this meeting. In my opinion, if we're going to have a department that is interested in protecting children from abuse, neglect, or abandonment, then when a case gets open, it has to be legitimate, has to have probable cause, etc., to be investigated. And it's okay if the government investigates that, but they should confine their investigation to the facts of the case, just like a police officer should. I guess you could say they have the right to go on fishing expeditions, but you're going to see me demonstrate in this meeting that we're not interested in fishing expeditions. Let me explain how the meeting came up. We had this referral to CPS. Because of the narrow nature of the referral, it was simply a question about an NG tube. We decided to go ahead and let the CPS social worker come to our home on Thanksgiving Day of all times and had her in our living room. And she was a contract social worker, and I have no complaints about her. She did a fine job. She was not overly invasive. And of course, I could have said no and all that, but if it's a narrow question, I don't mind if law enforcement is investigating. We haven't done anything evil or anything wrong, so I don't mind answering questions and help to clear up any miscommunication or misperceptions that caused the referral, which, by the way, is what happened. We actually, since this meeting, found out who reported us to CPS, and it was a complete mischaracterization of the situation. So we had this social worker in our home. She said I'd be hearing from the Department of Health and Welfare. I got a call from a social worker at the Department of Health and Welfare a week after Thanksgiving, after I met this social worker in my home. This social worker said, yeah, we're ready to close your case, but before we do it, we have to ask a few more questions of you, so can I come to your home to do that? And she said the questions we want to ask, because I asked her, are about what you do for a living and about your, quote, parenting philosophy, unquote. Now, that sounded a little strange to me because I don't see what my parenting philosophy has anything to do with NG tubes. I mean, I'm all for NG tubes, so that's my parenting philosophy about that. And I'm not interested in sharing my parenting philosophy about any other subject with the government. Why would I? I mean, if I have it published on my Facebook page or websites or my radio program, people can listen to it there. And then she said, we need to, quote, see your children, your other children. Not the child that was part of the referral that was referred to CPS, but the other children that live in our home. So I went ahead and hired an attorney, and we asked the department through the attorney, what do you mean when you need to see the other children? And what questions in particular do you want to ask about parenting philosophy? And that's when they told us that every time a case is open, they need to conduct a, quote, safety assessment of the home. And everything, the parent-child relationships, parent-child functioning. They need to interview all of the other children in the home, though they can do that as a group with the children, but the parents are not allowed to be in the interview to influence the answers. And guess what? The questions have nothing to do with the subject of the referral. Well, this is a broad fishing expedition, and I am not willing to make my family available to government fishing expeditions. We have nothing to hide, but think about this. What's the incentive for me to participate with the government here? There's no incentive because I'm not required to do so. There's no probable cause of a crime. There's no probable cause under the Child Protection Act to believe that my children are in danger. Why would I want to go ahead and just grant CPS a review of my life, especially because I love the Constitution of the United States. And when you don't exercise the Constitution of the United States, it's not just knowing it, but it's exercising your rights under it. You essentially waive your rights, and you lose your rights over time by not exercising them. So I like the 14th Amendment. In the Liberty Clause without due process, the courts have found that that means a right to privacy, and that right to privacy includes in the home environment and in the parent-child relationship. So I don't really want them invading the privacy of my home and asking my children questions about nothing that has to do with NG tubes or any other business outside the NG tube. And anyway, my children are not experts on NG tubes, so they're not even the right people to ask the question to as well. So we said no, and that's when the department asked for this interview. I'd like to point out that when the department social worker told me that she needed to see my children, she actually technically lied. She was obfuscating. I think they do this because they don't want to set the alarm bells off of the parents, and they figure if we just say we want to see the children, the parent will allow us into the home, and then we can announce that we actually want to interview the children. And if the parent had known that we wanted to interview the children outside of their presence the whole time, maybe the parent would have said no. And we want to get in and be able to ask these questions. So the safety assessment just seems like broad government overreach. I'd like to see it done away with. I'll let you go ahead and listen to this interview. You can collect your thoughts on it, and I'll give you my thoughts after the interview is over.
So I just talked to Krishanda. She's been working with you guys a little bit about kind of where we're at. She is new, so she's learning, and she's doing a great job. But it sounds like there's a little bit of pushback, resistance from you guys, so I just thought it would be easier for us just to get into a room and kind of talk about where you guys are coming from so that I understand, and maybe just share with you guys a little bit about our process and why and what that looks like. So I'm sorry about David.
Thank you.
It sounds like that has been a rough go, but that he's maybe doing a little better than what was originally.
He's actually pretty much fully recovered.
That is amazing.
Yeah,
I mean,
and literally on day one we were told he could die, and then beyond that first week we were told he could have major neurological implications like quadriplegia, no less.
Wow. Yeah,
and at this point he's back to where he was and actually advancing beyond where he was.
Okay, well that's good
so
then.
Pretty much a miracle.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like, so I'm very happy to hear that.
Yeah.
So what we would like to do is get out of your lives, because we have other more important things to do than harass people who are being good parents and taking care of their children.
Sure.
Our process has changed over the years, so I don't know if you're familiar with it at all. So I'm just gonna. They introduced about 4 years ago a new safety assessment, and it had to do with the fact that we were getting calls on families and we weren't asking the right questions, and so we would focus on the target child, which in this case would be David. We wouldn't ask those obvious questions of children like, do you feel safe? And they had a child that died on one of our caseloads. So they changed how we do our assessment, and it's a much more thorough assessment. Obviously we can use common sense when it's a situation like this. So really at this point what we're asking for is that you let, and I don't care if you stand where you can hear us. Like you're a parent. I expect that. Like I want you to be protective of your children. It's nice to see parents do the right thing. That's good. But basically, just a question of: do you guys feel safe? Is there anything that you need? Are you concerned about anything? That question is really the one that we need to ask. And so, I guess my thoughts would be: is what are your thoughts around that? And what barriers do you see with that?
Well, go ahead and go over for us what the original case was about specifically.
Yeah,
like
so it was
you have a referral, so if you could even just stick to exactly what the text of the referral was.
Yeah, and so that was obviously the concerns with David, that the initial one, which it sounds like it was a mistake, misrepresented, was that it could have been prevented. And so then after you talked to the doctor, it was very clear that was
okay, so you've
false.
talked to the doctor, so you're satisfied about the NG tube situation, is that correct?
Completely.
So the department is completely satisfied in that regard.
Yeah, and then we need a release to talk to so we had 2 referrals on David. So the original one was when he had a stroke, is my understanding, and somebody was alleging that it could have been prevented, that it had to do with lack of parental care.
And was that a licensed medical professional who was responsible for David's case who made that allegation?
I can't share who made that allegation, and here's the thing, like, it could be anybody off the street, which is kind of what makes our job, let me tell you, makes our job hard. We have many times where we have parents who are mad at each other because they're in the middle of a custody battle. They can call anonymously, not leave any information, and guess what we have to do? We have to go and investigate it just like it's anything else. And so, there's probably a little bit of a flaw to our system, but that's way beyond us. That's like, go legislate, go talk to our legislators and the state.
So the original referral would be that something that we did as parents were the cause of his stroke. Okay. So if, in order for that to be true, would you agree that there would have to be a medically diagnosable condition that was a pre-existing condition that
Well,
leads to stroke?
So all of that, like, I know where you're going with it, is
Yeah.
irrelevant because she talked to the doctor and the doctor said that was completely not true.
Okay, so you're already satisfied
So we're
about the
satisfied
original
with
referral as
original
well.
one. Yes,
Okay.
so that one's completely
So both
satisfied.
referrals,
No,
you
that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
First referral.
Okay,
I'm
got it.
satisfied.
Okay.
So then we got our second referral with the GI tube.
Mhm.
And then you talked to Dad, and you guys shared that it has already been dealt with, that you've already...
Yeah,
talked to
Selena had been to our home.
Okay.
Does Selena work in the department, or is she a contractor?
She's a contractor.
That's
She's
what I
our
thought.
on-call, after-hours worker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so she came to our home, and was she satisfied that we had obviously followed the medical professionals' consults?
So, the problem with our on-call, and this is probably why this is feeling a little bit redundant to you, is that they are trained to basically lay eyes on a child. They don't ask the right questions.
Okay.
It's a training issue. We're working on it, and so a lot of times her assessments are, we check the box, yes, the child was seen, so our time frames are met, but as far as our assessment, it's not done. And so
Okay.
that's where Krishanda is coming in,
Okay.
going, I have this paper that I have these, and I can even show you a copy of one, of these questions that have to be answered, and she has no answer. So
Okay. So
on
let's go back to the question. So the open question in your mind was related to the NG2. So if we provided you with a St. Luke's discharge paper that says that on November 22nd, when we were discharged, that they were fully aware and had consulted with us about the NG tube, and that they were satisfied that going home without an NG tube for 2 to 3 days was perfectly within what we had discussed with them, and they thought that was fine, would you be satisfied that whoever referred to you on November 22nd with concern about the NG tube, that clearly the medical professionals were already approving of our going home without an NG tube?
Well, that would be helpful information, but unfortunately, it had already been, it was called in anyway, and so, like, that's helpful because it shows that, obviously the information, whoever had the information didn't
was
have
wrong.
the full story.
Yeah.
Right. We used to be able to do in our system, click erroneous, and we go away.
Okay.
They have taken that away from us.
Okay, got it.
I wish we could do that, because
Yeah.
then I would say, yes, give me that, let's click erroneous, and let's
Perfect.
get out of your life.
Okay.
They've changed it. We can't do that.
Okay.
Okay, so who is they that's changed it?
The state, like the
Okay.
feds, the federal government, and the state of Idaho.
Okay, and how long ago was this?
Like, when did they pull that? It's probably been 4+ years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So is there a policy that you guys have that we could be provided, or, I mean, you guys have to have something that says that you have to do this?
No, most people don't question us. Like, that's the thing, you
Yeah.
know? And that's
Basically, here's where we're coming from. So you would have to provide us with statutory authority that shows that you have the right, by legal authority, to go beyond the original referral to ask us questions that are not related to the original referral. And where we're coming from is that we think that someone who referred to you was not in the know and was not one of the actual medical professionals in charge of David's case. So we have documentation from the medical professionals that say they were in the know and that the original referral was erroneous. And so we are able to provide that documentation to you from those medical professionals.
Right.
And we are, because of the Constitution of the United States, are not willing to let you, and also because of statute, because Idaho recognizes parental authority in the home over their children, and since there's been no referral made to you about any of our other children, we would like to retain our constitutional abilities to go ahead and not allow you access to the other children, since there's no concern that's been raised with the department regarding them. Unless you can provide some legal authority that requires us to make them available
I can give you a
to
copy of our standards.
Yeah, it would have to be a legal authority
Yeah,
that
I can-
obviously supersedes, the constitutional authority.
Well, and so here's the thing: in the state of Idaho, like child protection, our legal stuff, like law enforcement, they can't go talk to your children without your permission. child protection because of what we do with child abuse and protecting vulnerable children, sometimes unfortunately from their parents, like we have more authority to do that.
Well, actually, so to correct you, and you don't mind if I say this, right? I mean, child protection has no more legal authority than a law enforcement officer. So we've studied this quite a bit in the federal courts because we're in the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit has affirmed that even though you're in the child protection business, that you actually don't possess any more legal authority than a law enforcement officer when it comes to the Constitution of the United States. So a parent retains legal authority over their children. And so if we don't grant our consent, then you can't go to a court, according to our knowledge of the Constitution and court precedent, and obtain something that any other law enforcement officer cannot also obtain.
Okay. So I'm going to put a stop to this because obviously you're taking a very legal stance on this. I was hoping that we could come together as individuals with our best intentions.
Mm-hmm.
We can get what we need. You can have your life back. Obviously you want to take this to a much more legal slant, which we can do that. So I will get a hold of our Deputy Attorney General. I will ask her to provide some written documentation, and then I will staff it with my higher ups, and we can just look at possibly doing like a court summons, where we'll just have you guys come into court. You state on what authority you're refusing to cooperate with us, and then she can court order you to do it. And then at that point, you guys can decide what you want to do. Not saying that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to staff it up, but that's one of our options. I think that generally we have the best interests, the best intentions. Families usually realize that, bring their kids in, call it good, and we're done. And so, I don't know where you're coming from or why, but I respect that as a parent that you're right. So I'll just look at it differently, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. And in the meantime, we'd be very happy to provide his discharge paperwork related to the original
because I'll show them
referral.
that and see if they're willing to make an exception based on the fact that
Yeah, that sounds great, because that obviously sounds like you were satisfied on the first referral, and then it sounds like as far as the second referral, we can certainly provide a legal document.
Yeah, we were allowed to just kind of politely ignore the first one because we talked to the doctor and he said no, that was completely erroneous. So perhaps I can get the same pardon type thing.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, if you could basically work with us.
Perfect. And then
if there's nothing here, I swear she said it was okay.
and then the doctor that you're working with now, are you okay if we contact him and just verify that he's under medical, you're following through type thing? I think she said that you guys were okay with that, but I don't know what that.
Yeah, I mean that it would be fine for him to make a statement that he is, that David's in ongoing medical care.
That's all we need.
Because that's actually exactly what's happening.
Perfect. Okay. And then if you guys have documentation showing that the discharge was not as we were told, and you can get that
Yes,
to us,
which we
I would
can get.
appreciate that.
And then the other thing, because it sounds to me like you were asking about what safety of the children in the home, that the other thing we have offered to you is we would be willing to have our children go see a licensed physician in the state of Idaho, and then he can make a statement as to their health condition.
Yeah, and
if that would satisfy you.
that's not what we mean by safety. So what we mean by safety is more all-encompassing. As far as, are you getting 3 meals a day? Are you being locked in a closet? We're looking way beyond that, just crazy stuff. And so that was why we were just hoping that you would let us just visit with the kids.
Yeah, but there is a right to privacy in the United States Constitution. So.
Yep. I understand that.
Okay, so there's the interview. Point out a few things in the interview. Notice how they were satisfied as to the original referral. In essence, we've got a couple more pieces of paper we were going to provide to them. But then notice when we said, well, what's your legal authority? Do you have this policy written as to answer, having the children be asked questions? And they said, no one's ever asked us that. That's a problem. It takes the citizens to push back on the unrestrained growth of government. If we don't exercise our constitutional rights and our desire to control government overreach, then nobody else is going to force government to limit their reach. And so it's up to us. And I've done this as part of my ministry. You can look at my YouTube channel and see me interacting with police officers that violate the First Amendment regularly, that will lie to you, etc. I'm not saying these social workers are terrible people, but I honestly don't believe they have my family's interests at heart. I think they have their own interests at heart, their own ideas. people tend to be very selfishly oriented. The department will be oriented toward its own self-interest. And while I believe there's probably some altruism there, I don't think they have a right to go ahead and go on broad fishing expeditions in every Idahoan's home. And that's why I said no. I'm a little disappointed that nobody ever questions them. And sure enough, to this date, it's about 10 days after our meeting that you just listened to, they haven't produced any written legal authority that says that they can question our children, and they're probably not going to be able to do that, because how do you produce a legal authority that supersedes the Constitution without having it be a court order? But also, I'm very disappointed that the department, instead of, when we told her that unless you can provide some legal authority, we're going to say no, the supervisor at that point probably should have just said, well, okay, I'll go ahead and talk to my management about this. Instead, she went ahead and threatened, and that would be an attempt at coercion. I mean, I know government officers are guilty of this all the time because I've experienced it from police officers, etc., in my work as a minister of the gospel on the street. But it's disappointing. We only have 1.6 million people here in Idaho. I'm one of the voters in Idaho. And it's disappointing that even in a small state like this, you have to worry about government officials using the threat of legal action to coerce law-abiding citizens, because I have nothing, I am law-abiding, but to coerce me into doing something that you want me to do that you have no probable cause and you have no constitutional right to do, and all I'm doing is exercising my rights under the United States Constitution. So that was a little disappointing. So I guess several points of takeaway here. You see the government threat of coercion. You see the government overreach, that they want to conduct a broad fishing investigation. They lied to me initially so that they could make an attempt to get into my home and then probably conduct their broad fishing investigation. And then they've never experienced any resistance, apparently, to these broad fishing expeditions. And I hope to encourage other Idaho citizens to not fear the government, even when it's CPS. The only reason you should fear government is if you've actually done evil. If you're a criminal, you should fear government. The government has been ordained to wield swords against evildoers. But in my case, I'm not a criminal, and so I don't have to worry about the government overreach. Okay, so my recommendation is that we probably need to ask our state legislators to create some sort of oversight of this agency. I can think legislatively as part of the Child Protection Act, which is Title 16, Chapter 16, that we might want to get rid of the mandatory reporting requirement that makes every Idahoan subject to the mandatory reporting requirement. Did you know all of your neighbors, whether they're medical professionals or not, if they suspect abandonment, abuse, neglect, they're required to report it under threat of a misdemeanor to the Department of Health and Welfare, to CPS. And it seems to me like that makes every citizen an agent of the state and puts a burden on us to become government agents against our fellow citizens. I don't like that idea. I can imagine it creates a lot of extra business for CPS, which is probably what they want. Departments of government tend to want to grow and increase their budgets and increase the number of services they provide and increase the number of client citizens that they serve. But as citizens, I want to see government grow smaller. In other words, shrink. I want to see it shrink and get smaller and get out of citizens' lives so we can get on with our business. Then, number two, I think we ought to put some legislative restraint on these broad fishing expeditions. Now, all states are doing this. This isn't just an Idaho thing. They've all decided that they can mitigate future risk in families and try to identify problems in the future in families by conducting these, quote, safety assessments. And they believe that they have the psychological background experience and studies that show if they ask the right questions, they can head off problems in the future. But in the meantime, they're basically ignoring the Constitution, the right to privacy contained therein, and they're prying into every area of Idahoans' lives with every CPS referral and everybody they come into contact with, and apparently most of Idahoans are cooperating with them. I would like to see some legislative restraint written into statute that basically takes away from the department their ability to conduct fishing expeditions. So please consider this. Get a hold of your Idaho legislator, your senator, your representative. Ask them to consider modifying the Child Protection Act to take away from the department the ability to probe outside of the subject of the referral that's been made to the department, and to also modify the mandatory reporting requirement. Thanks for watching my video.